She didn't knock. Vivian Mercer walked straight into the county records office like she owned it, because in every way that mattered, she did. She dropped a leather folder onto the clerk's desk, slid a folded document across the wood, and said, without looking up, "File this by end of day. The Ashbourne parcel transfers to my name upon default. He's got 60 days. The clerk's pen hovered. "But ma'am, there's a new—" 60 days, Vivian repeated, and her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Or find yourself another position." She was already walking out before the door finished swinging. That was the moment. Not the blizzard coming down from the mountains, not the fire that would come later, not even the wedding. That changed everything. Because Vivian Mercer had no idea that 60 miles away, a woman with calloused hands and her dead father's last letter in her coat pocket was already walking toward that ranch. If you've ever had to choose between surviving and living, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end, because every part of it matters. And if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The cold came early that year, not the kind of cold that settles in politely, that gives you a week to stack the firewood and patch the gaps under the door. This was the kind that arrived without announcement, dropped the temperature 30 degrees in a single night, and left the ground hard as iron before October had even finished its business. Maris Calloway felt every step of it. She had been walking since before sunrise. 12 miles from the stage stop in Cutter's Bend, following a dirt road that had been more suggestion than certainty for the last 4 miles, with nothing but a weathered carpet bag in her right hand and a folded letter inside her coat, pressed flat against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She was 26 years old. She had $17 and some coins. She had no family left. And she was walking toward a man she had never met, carrying her dead father's last words, about to ask for something that made her stomach turn every time she thought too hard about it. She stopped once, halfway up a low ridge, and looked back the way she'd come. There was nothing behind her, just the road, the frozen grass, and the gray sky pulling itself tighter over the mountains. She turned back around and kept walking. Rhett Ashbourne was splitting wood when he heard the sound. Not footsteps. He didn't hear those until much later. What he heard first was the gate at the end of his drive, the old iron latch that gave a specific complaint when someone lifted it from the outside. He'd spent 4 years hearing nothing lift that latch except the wind. He set the axe down slowly. He didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the woodpile. That was deliberate. He'd made a private rule about that. He didn't reach for it the moment something was unfamiliar. He'd learned, the hard way, that fear makes a fool of a man faster than almost anything else. He walked around the side of the house and stopped. There was a woman standing in the middle of his drive. She wasn't young in the way that meant inexperienced. She had a quality to her stillness that suggested she'd already learned some expensive lessons. Her coat was good wool, but showing the wear of hard use. Her boots were practical. Her face was windburned and pale, and she had the kind of expression that had already rehearsed this moment several times and was now measuring whether any of those rehearsals had been accurate. She held a carpet bag in one hand. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at him the way someone looks at a stranger they've already decided to trust, which made Rhett feel unsteady in a way he couldn't name. "Mr. Ashbourne," she said finally. Not a question. "That's right." "My name is Maris Calloway. My father was Henry Calloway." Rhett went very still. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 11 years, not once. He'd thought about the man probably more than was reasonable, in the way you think about a debt you know you can never properly repay. But hearing the name out loud, in a woman's voice, standing in his own front drive with snow starting to spit from the sky. "He passed," she said. Not gently, not harshly, just directly, the way you say something when you've already run out of softer ways to carry it. "About 3 weeks ago. He asked me to come here." Rhett exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry." "I have his letter. He said you'd want to read it." She reached inside her coat and held it out. He crossed the distance between them and took it. The envelope had been handled many times. The corners were soft, the paper worn along the fold lines. He opened it with care, the way you handle something that belongs to someone who no longer exists to ask for it back. Henry's handwriting was worse than he remembered. Looser, shakier, the letters leaning hard to the right the way a man writes when keeping a pen steady has become its own effort. Rhett, I'm sorry to do this to you. I know it's an imposition, and I know it isn't fair, and if I had any other card to play, I'd play it instead. But I've been through every hand I've got, and this is the last one. Maris is the finest person I ever raised, which isn't saying much since she turned out better than anything I could have planned. She's smart, and she's capable, and she's honest to a fault, which is the one thing in this world that keeps getting people like her into trouble. The frontier is a hard place for a woman with no husband and no family. You know this. I know you know this because you've seen it. I'm not asking you to fall in love with her. I'm not that much of a fool. I'm asking you to give her a roof and a name and a fair chance. I'm asking you to let her be safe. You told me once that you owed me a debt you didn't know how to repay. I'm telling you now how to repay it. Henry Rhett folded the letter carefully. He did not look up for a long moment. The wind pushed between them. The first real snowflakes of the season started drifting down, unhurried, indifferent to the conversation happening beneath them. How long were you walking? He asked finally. Since before light. You didn't take the stage from Cutter's Bend? I had enough for the fare or enough for food, not both. He looked at her then, really looked. Not the quick assessment he'd done when she first appeared in the drive. She was exhausted. She was holding herself straight because she'd decided she was going to hold herself straight, not because it was easy. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't come from one bad night's sleep, and she was watching him with the careful attention of someone who was prepared to hear no, had already planned what she would do if she heard it, and was hoping she wouldn't have to. Come inside, he said. You need something warm before any kind of conversation. Mr. Ashbourne, come inside first. We can figure out the rest after. He made a coffee because it was the only thing he knew how to make that qualified as hospitality. It was strong and not particularly good, and he knew it, but she wrapped both hands around the tin cup and drank it without complaint, which told him something about how cold she actually was. He sat across the table from her and tried to think through the situation with some kind of order, which was difficult because the situation did not lend itself to order. Henry Calloway had saved his life. That was the plain and unalterable fact underneath everything else. 11 years ago, in a different part of the territory, when Rhett had been younger and considerably more reckless, and had gotten himself into a situation with a flooding river and a horse that had made a poor decision, Henry had been the one who came off his own horse and went into that water. He hadn't asked who Rhett was. He hadn't weighed the odds first. He'd just gone in. And now Henry was dead, and his daughter was sitting in Rhett's kitchen drinking bad coffee, and there was a letter sitting on the table between them that made the path forward very clear and very uncomfortable at the same time. I know what the letter said, Maris said quietly. She'd been watching him think. And I know what you're working through. So I'd rather just say it plainly and let you respond plainly. All right. My father is asking you to marry me. That's the substance of it. She said it the way you pull a splinter out, quick and direct because the slow approach only makes it worse. I want to be honest with you about what I think of that. Please. I think it's an unusual solution to a genuine problem. The problem is real. A woman alone in this territory, with no land and no family, is in a precarious situation. That's not self-pity, it's arithmetic. She turned the cup in her hands. But I want to be equally honest that I'm not here to become your housekeeper or your obligation. If there's an arrangement to be made, it needs to be an actual arrangement. Equal authority over the property. Equal voice in decisions. My name on whatever I help build here. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Your father wasn't exaggerating about the honest to a fault part. He rarely exaggerated. What do you know about running a ranch? Something shifted behind her eyes. Not defensiveness exactly, but a kind of precision. My father ran 200 acres in the valley north of here for 15 years before his health failed. I kept his books from the time I was 14. I know livestock management. I know soil assessment. I know what poor record keeping does to a property over a decade. And I know how to read a land survey. She paused. What do you know about running this one? He almost smiled. Almost. Apparently less than I thought. I'm not trying to insult you. I know. That's what makes it sting. She studied him. He was a difficult man to read. She'd known that from the moment she saw him standing at the corner of the house, still and watchful, and not reaching for anything dangerous. That restraint told her something, Most men, alone too long, developed a hair trigger. This one had developed something else. "What did my father tell you about me?" Rhett asked. "Enough." She hesitated, and for the first time something flickered across her face that wasn't controlled. "He said you'd been through something that made you want to stop being in the world. He said you were a good man who'd convinced himself he was better off alone." The kitchen was very quiet. "I wasn't wrong," Rhett said finally. "No, but he wasn't entirely right either, or you would have sent me down the road the moment I came through that gate." Another silence. This one felt different from the others, less like a gap and more like something being weighed. "The house has 2 bedrooms," Rhett said. "There's no, I want to be clear that I'm not asking for, I understood that without you needing to say it. I owe your father a debt. That's the honest truth of why I'm considering this." "I know." "And you're all right with that being the reason?" She looked at him steadily. "I'd rather have honesty about a practical reason than pretend it's something it isn't. I've had enough pretending to last me." He nodded slowly. "Then I think we should talk about what equal authority actually means before either of us agrees to anything." For the first time since she'd come through that gate, Maris Calloway let herself breathe. They talked for 3 hours. Not around things, through them. He laid out the state of the ranch without flattering it. The debts, the livestock numbers, the fence sections that needed replacing, the well that had been temperamental since August. He told her about the loan he'd taken from the Territorial Bank 18 months ago and the terms of it and the fact that he was behind. She listened to all of it without flinching. Then she asked him to show her the ledger. He brought it to the table and watched her face as she went through it. She didn't make sounds of dismay or click her tongue or do any of the things that would have made him defensive. She just read, turned pages, read some more. "This entry," she said, pointing. "Feed purchase, September, that's high. I bought from Aldrich's. Aldrich's charges a premium. There's a supplier in Millhaven that runs about 20% less. Millhaven's farther. Not enough farther to justify 20%. Not for a property already carrying debt." He said nothing. She was right. He'd known she was right before she finished the sentence. "I'm not saying this to be critical," she added. "I'm saying it because it's the kind of thing that compounds. Small inefficiencies over 2 or 3 years become the reason a property fails. Not the storm, not the drought, the feed supplier. You do know how to run a ranch. I know how to keep one from bleeding out quietly." She closed the ledger. "There's a difference." By the time the afternoon light started failing, they had the shape of something. Not a romance. Neither of them would have recognized it as that or wanted to. What they had was an agreement, a real one, not the kind that leaves the important things vague enough to fight about later. She would have her name on the deed within the month. She would have full access to the accounts and equal signature authority at the bank. She would have her own room, her own time, and her own opinions respected whether he agreed with them or not. He would have someone who wouldn't leave when things got hard. They shook hands on it, actual handshake, across the kitchen table, like a business arrangement between 2 people who had decided to trust each other on purpose rather than by accident. "There's one more thing," Maris said, and her voice was quieter now. "I want to say thank you for not sending me away. I had—" She stopped, started again. "I had a plan if you did. I wasn't going to fall apart, but I'm glad I don't have to use it." "What was the plan?" "That's not your concern." But there was the faintest edge of something, maybe humor, maybe relief, at the corner of her mouth. It would have worked, though. He believed her. They were married 4 days later in the county seat, with the justice of the peace and 2 witnesses pulled from the street because the law required them. There were no flowers. There was no celebration. Maris wore her better dress, which was the blue wool, and Rhett wore the coat that still mostly fit, and the justice of the peace read the words, and they both said the right things at the right moments, and then it was done. On the ride back to the ranch, they didn't talk much. The wagon moved through the frozen landscape, and the horses breathed white clouds into the cold air, and Maris sat with her hands in her lap and thought about her father. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying privately, in the 3 weeks between his death and this moment, in whatever private corners had been available. She didn't believe in performing grief for an audience, even an audience of one. But she thought about him, about the way he'd always said that the most honest thing a person could do was make a decision they could live with when things went wrong, not when things went right, Anyone could look good when things went right. The test was what you chose when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. She'd made her decision. She could live with it. "You all right?" Rhett asked, not looking at her. "Yes." "You've been quiet." "I'm often quiet." "So am I." A pause. "Good to know we're compatible in at least one way." It wasn't quite a joke, but it wasn't quite not one either. The ranch came into view as the sun started dropping behind the western ridge, and Maris looked at it with new eyes. Not the eyes of a stranger assessing, but something more complicated than that. It wasn't home yet. She didn't believe in the kind of sentiment that made a place home the moment you decided it should be. But it was a beginning. She'd made do with less. The first days settled into their own rhythm, almost without either of them engineering it. She was up before he was. He accepted this without comment, and when he came down to find the coffee already made, and she was at the table with the ledger and a list of notes in her small, precise handwriting, he poured his cup and sat across from her and waited to hear what she'd found. It was not a warm arrangement. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was functional in the way that two competent people who've decided to cooperate can be functional. No wasted words, no performance. Just the work of keeping something alive in a season that was trying hard to kill it. She reorganized the supply purchases within the first week. She wrote 3 letters, to the Millhaven supplier, to a livestock broker she'd dealt with through her father's operation, and to the Territorial Bank, formally notifying them of her co-signatory status. That last letter she showed to Rhett before sending it. He read it twice. "You wrote this yourself?" "Yes." "It reads like it was written by a lawyer." "My father always said that if you want people to take a document seriously, you write it so they don't know who to argue with." He handed it back. "Send it." The second improvement was the livestock rotation schedule she rewrote, pulling from what she could see in 2 days of observing which pastures were depleted and which hadn't been properly rested. Rhett watched her walk the fence lines in the early morning, making notes, and resisted the urge to tell her what she was looking at. He could see from a distance that she already knew. "You could have told me what you were doing," he said that evening. "I wasn't ready to discuss it until I'd finished thinking." "Fair. Most people want to talk before they've thought. I find that produces more argument than progress." He couldn't argue with the observation. By the end of the first week, something had shifted in the ranch's atmosphere that Rhett couldn't quantify, but could feel. Like a machine that had been running with loose parts being quietly tightened. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to in a single moment. Just the cumulative effect of someone paying actual attention to things that had been ignored. He was aware, in a low and uncomfortable way, that he had not been paying attention. Not the way she paid attention. He'd been managing, getting through each day, keeping the animals alive, maintaining the basic operations. That was different from actually running something. He knew the difference now that he was seeing it. He didn't say any of this to her. There wasn't a way to say it that didn't sound like either praise that would embarrass them both, or an apology that would require her to respond to it. Instead, he fixed the section of fence on the south pasture that he'd been meaning to fix since August. She noticed. She didn't say anything either. That was how they spoke in those early days, in actions, not words. Work done acknowledged other work done. Effort recognized effort. It was a language that suited them both in ways that talking hadn't yet managed. And then, on the 5th night, Maris couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark with her father's letter in her hands. Not reading it. She'd read it enough times that she had it memorized. Just holding it, the way you hold something that's the last physical object connecting you to a person who no longer exists. She was not entirely at peace with the decision she'd made. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. The logic of it was sound. The necessity of it was real. But there were moments, in the quiet hours, when she allowed herself to acknowledge that this was not the life she would have chosen if choosing had been an option. She would have chosen differently. She would have chosen her father not dying. She would have chosen having land of her own, built the way she'd helped build his, earned through years of visible effort, rather than transferred through a legal arrangement that required her to bind her name to a stranger's. She was not ungrateful. That was important to say clearly, even inside her own head. Rhett Ashbourne had given her something real, and she knew it. But gratitude and peace weren't the same thing, and she wasn't going to confuse them just because it was easier. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at her at the table in the dark, and didn't say anything for a moment. He just went to the stove, moved the coffee pot to the heat, and waited. "Couldn't sleep," she said, though he obviously knew. "Same." "You don't have to—" "I know." He wasn't saying it to be kind. He was saying it because it was true. He didn't have to. He was there because the kitchen was where the coffee was, and he couldn't sleep either. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in her coat pocket. "He talked about you sometimes," she said. "My father. He didn't tell me the story. I always thought that was yours to tell if you wanted to. But he mentioned you. Said there were people in the world who were decent in a way that wasn't convenient for them. That you were one of them." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. He was too generous. He wasn't generous. He was accurate. There's a difference. The coffee started to make sounds. He poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, sat down. "What was he like?" Rhett said. "At the end." She thought about that. "Peaceful," she said finally. Which surprised me because he was not a peaceful man by nature. He worried. About everything. About the land, about the animals, about whether he'd done enough with what he had. She turned the cup. But at the end, he stopped worrying. I think he'd made his decisions, and he was satisfied with them. He'd made his decision about you. Yes. And you think it was the right one? She met his eyes across the table. I think he had no way of knowing whether it was right. He was making the best choice available with the information he had. That's all any of us can do. A pause. But yes, she added quietly, I think it was the right one. Outside, the wind moved through the dark. The ranch settled around them. The small sounds of wood contracting in the cold, the distant shift of the horses in the barn, the low creak of the gate at the end of the drive. That gate. Maris heard it. She looked up. Rhett had heard it too. She could see it in how he'd gone still. Wind, she said, but her voice was uncertain. Maybe. He wasn't convinced either. He rose from the table. She didn't ask him not to go, and she didn't follow immediately. She waited 2 seconds, then followed. The front door opened onto cold black air. Rhett stood in the doorway and looked down the drive toward the gate. It was closed. Nothing there. Just the dark and the wind and the bare branches of the cottonwood snapping slowly in the cold. But the latch had moved. She'd heard it. He'd heard it. And as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Maris saw something else. A single track in the frost on the path to the gate. A boot print. Pointed inward, toward the house, as if someone had come to the gate, lifted the latch, thought better of it, and retreated. She said nothing. Rhett had seen it too. He closed the door. They stood in the hallway and looked at each other in the dim light from the kitchen, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that 5 days was not very long at all before someone noticed them. And someone already had. Rhett didn't mention the boot print the next morning, neither did Maris. But she noticed that he checked the gate latch twice before breakfast, and she noticed that he positioned himself differently at the kitchen table, with his back to the wall instead of the window. She didn't comment on either thing. Some adjustments didn't need to be named to be understood. What she did instead was go back to the ledger. She had been working through it systematically, the way her father had taught her. Not looking for problems exactly, but following the money the way you follow water. Watching where it moved and where it stopped and where it disappeared into the ground without explanation. Most ledgers told you the story of a property if you were patient enough to read them. This one was telling her several things at once, and not all of them were about feed costs and livestock numbers. There was a pattern in the property tax assessments going back 4 years. Small increases, consistent, unremarkable on their own. But when she laid them out in sequence against the county average, she'd asked Rhett for the notices from the assessor's office, and he'd produced them from a box under the stairs with the bewildered expression of a man who had never thought to compare them to anything. The Ashbourne parcel had been assessed at a rate running 15 to 20% above comparable land in the valley. She wrote the numbers out, looked at them for a long time. Then she wrote down the name of the county assessor, which was printed on each notice in the same careful bureaucratic hand, J. Colton Briggs. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket next to her father's letter, which was becoming a crowded pocket, and said nothing about it yet. She wasn't ready to discuss it. She needed to understand what she was seeing before she tried to explain it to someone else. Rhett came in from the barn mid-morning, stomping mud from his boots. and poured himself coffee without sitting down. He had the particular restlessness of a man who'd been thinking about something he didn't know how to bring up. "You sleeping all right?" he asked, which was not what he wanted to ask. "Well enough. Because if the room's too cold, there's another blanket in the—" "Rhett," he stopped. "What are you actually trying to ask me?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his cup down and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, which was, she was learning, his version of settling in for a real conversation. "The gate last night," he said. "I don't want to alarm you, but I also don't want to pretend it was wind when I don't believe it was wind. I don't believe it was wind either. Somebody came to that gate and decided not to come through." "Yes." "Which means somebody knows you're here and somebody wanted to have a look. Or somebody already knew I was here," she said, "and wanted us to know that they knew." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a more unpleasant interpretation. It's the one that fits the boot print. If someone was just curious, they'd have come closer. The print was right at the gate. They lifted the latch, made enough noise for us to hear it, and left. That's not curiosity. That's a message." Rhett's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, something more careful than that. "You think about things like this naturally, or did something teach you to?" "My father," she said simply. "He said the most dangerous thing a person can do is assume that the people who want something from you are operating at your level of honesty." She went back to her notes. He picked up his coffee and stood there for a moment longer, and she could feel him reconsidering something, some version of this situation he'd been holding that was simpler than the one he was now standing in. "I need to go into town this afternoon," he said. "Supply run. You want to come?" She looked up. "Yes." He seemed mildly surprised that she answered without hesitation. She didn't explain it. The reason was simple. She wanted to see this town. She wanted to see who looked at them when they walked through it together, and how they looked, and what that might tell her. Cutter's Bend was not a large town, but it was the kind of town that had opinions about itself. The main street ran straight and wide, with the general store on one end and the land office on the other, and in between were the arrangements that kept a frontier community functioning: feed and tack, a small bank, a physician's office, a lawyer whose shingle looked newer than most of the buildings around it. Rhett drove the wagon with the practiced ease of a man who'd made this trip enough times that he did it without thinking. Maris sat beside him and paid attention to everything. The first thing she noticed was the stillness that settled over the people on the street when the wagon came into view. Not dramatic, not the kind of stillness that happens when someone dangerous appears. Something quieter and more social. The kind of stillness that means people are adjusting what they were about to say. A woman outside the dry goods store watched them with an expression that was carefully arranged into pleasantness, but was doing too much work to be genuine. Two men near the feed store exchanged a look that lasted 1 second too long. An older man on the steps of the land office watched them all the way down the street and then turned and went inside. "Does this town usually watch you when you come through?" she asked quietly. "Not like this." "How long has it been since you brought anyone to town with you?" A pause. "Years." "So this is about me." "Seems that way." She kept her expression neutral. It was an interesting kind of attention, not hostile exactly, but assessing, measuring. She had the sense of being evaluated against a standard she hadn't been told about, which was irritating in the way that only things you can't argue with directly are irritating. They pulled up in front of the general store and Rhett climbed down first, then offered his hand. She took it, not because she needed the assistance, but because she understood that some gestures are less about the people making them and more about the people watching. The inside of the store smelled like coffee beans and dried herbs, and the particular mustiness of bulk flour kept in wooden barrels. The owner, a compact man named Decker, with a broom mustache and ink-stained fingers, looked up from the counter with the practiced smile of someone who'd made a decision about how he was going to handle this before they walked in. "Mr. Ashbourne, good to see you." His eyes moved to Maris. "And this would be, my wife," Rhett said. He said it without hesitation, and Maris noticed that, and filed it somewhere. "Ah." Decker extended his hand across the counter. "Congratulations to you both. We hadn't heard, well, news travels in its own time, I suppose." "It does," Maris said pleasantly, and shook his hand. She watched his face while they talked, watched the way his eyes moved when Rhett mentioned ordering additional supplies. The slight recalibration that happened when she added her own items to the list. And he looked to Rhett, automatically, without thinking, and Rhett said, "Add it to the account," without referring it back to her for confirmation. Small things. The kind of small things that told you everything about how a world was organized and where you were supposed to fit in it. They were in the store for 20 minutes. In that time, 3 different people found reasons to come in, greet Rhett, and look at her with varying degrees of transparency. None of them said anything rude. All of them communicated a clear and common question through the simple language of frontier social behavior. Who are you? Where did you come from? And what claim do you think you have here? She gave them nothing to work with. She was pleasant and direct and didn't volunteer anything, and by the time they were loading the wagon, she'd formed a rough picture of the social landscape that she thought was probably accurate. What she hadn't formed a picture of yet was Vivian Mercer. That particular picture arrived on its own terms, 2 days later, in the form of a black carriage that came up the drive mid-morning with a self-assurance that said it had never been told no by a road. Maris was at the kitchen table when she heard it. She looked out the window at the carriage, fine wood, brass fittings, a driver in a coat that cost more than most ranch hands made in a month, and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite alarm but was adjacent to it. The kind of feeling that your body produces when something arrives that it already knows is going to be complicated. She went to the door before the knock. The woman standing on the porch was somewhere in her 50s and dressed with the particular elegance of someone who had decided that looking wealthy in a frontier town was a statement rather than an indulgence. Her coat was imported, her gloves were fine leather. Her smile was the best thing money could buy, and she deployed it with the ease of long practice. "Mrs. Ashbourne," she said, and her voice was warm and genuine sounding, which Maris understood immediately was the most important thing about her. "I'm Vivian Mercer. I should have come sooner to welcome you properly, but the weather has been simply terrible, hasn't it?" "Please come in," Maris said. She stepped back and watched Vivian Mercer walk into her kitchen with the unconscious assurance of a woman who had never entered a room she didn't already feel she belonged in. She looked around with appreciative eyes, at the ledger on the table, at the reorganized shelves, at the new curtain rod Maris had hung 3 days ago because the old one had been pulling out of the wall. "You've made it lovely," Vivian said. "Rhett always kept things practical." "He still does. We just added some efficiency." A brief pause, almost imperceptible. "Of course." She settled into the chair Maris indicated, arranging herself in it the way a woman arranges herself when she's accustomed to people waiting while she gets comfortable. "I hope you don't mind. I always feel that new neighbors should know they have friends close by. This valley can feel very isolated in winter." "It's kind of you to say. Where are you from originally, if you don't mind my asking?" "The North Valley. My father ran land up there." "Calloway?" Something moved in Vivian's eyes, quick as a fish beneath water. "I believe I knew of your father, Henry Calloway?" "That's right." "I heard he passed. I'm sorry for your loss." She said it perfectly, the right weight, the right pause. "He had a solid reputation, though I understand his property was—" "There were difficulties at the end?" Maris kept her expression entirely still. "All properties have their challenges." "Of course," Vivian smiled. "Well, it must be a relief to be settled somewhere secure. Rhett's land is good land, even if it's been a little, shall we say, underperforming?" She tilted her head. "Has he shown you the full extent of the property?" "The spring, especially. That mountain spring is really the heart of what makes this parcel valuable. We've walked the boundaries." Vivian folded her hands on the table. "I only mention it because I have a long-standing interest in that parcel, going back many years. Rhett and I have discussed it from time to time, the possibility of some kind of arrangement around water rights, or even a purchase. Nothing formal, just neighborly conversation." She smiled again. "I wouldn't want a new member of the community to be unaware of ongoing discussions." Maris looked at her steadily. "Has Rhett indicated that those discussions are continuing?" "Well, not recently, but circumstances change." "They do," Maris agreed. "For example, the property now has 2 owners. Any discussion about an arrangement would need to include us both." Something cooled in Vivian's expression by several degrees. Not anger. Maris didn't think anger was something Vivian allowed herself to display in the field, but a reassessment, a quiet recalibration. Naturally, Vivian said pleasantly. I look forward to speaking with you both. Perhaps once you've had more time to understand the full situation of the property, the debt structure, the seasonal challenges, you'll have a clearer picture of what options make sense. I already have a fairly clear picture, Maris said, but I appreciate the concern. They looked at each other across the table for one moment that was the clearest communication of the entire visit. Then Vivian stood, smoothed her coat, and said she really must be going, and what a delight it had been, and she hoped Maris would feel welcome in the community. Maris walked her to the door and watched the black carriage move back down the drive with that same unhurried certainty, and she stood on the porch until it was out of sight. Then she went back inside and sat at the table and opened the ledger to the page where she'd noted the property tax discrepancies. She added a new line: Mercer, spring, water rights, long-standing interest. When Rhett came back from the south pasture that afternoon, she told him about the visit. All of it, the conversation, the phrasing Vivian had used, the moment when she'd mentioned the debt structure, the smile that worked too hard. He sat across from her and listened without interrupting. That was something she'd come to count on in the past week. He knew how to listen. Not in the impatient way of someone waiting for you to finish so they could respond, but actually following the information, tracking it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. She's been after the spring for years, he said. She never made a formal offer, which I always thought was strange. Just kept mentioning it. Kept suggesting that maybe things would get difficult enough that I'd want to sell. That's not coincidence, Maris said. If she never formalized the offer, it was because she was waiting for conditions that would force your hand without her having to pay market price. Waiting for me to fail. Or arranging for it. She said it carefully, watching his face. The tax assessments, Rhett. Your parcel has been running 15 to 20% above comparable land in the valley. For 4 years. That's not random error. He stared at her. J. Colton Briggs. You know him? Everybody knows Briggs. He and Vivian have been... He stopped. They're close, politically. She helped him get appointed. Maris laid the numbers out on the table between them. He studied them for a long moment, and she watched something change in his face. Not the sharp surprise of new information, but the slower, heavier feeling of things you half knew falling into a shape you couldn't unknow. She's been squeezing me, he said quietly. Slowly enough that I thought it was just bad luck. Poor seasons. My own poor management. Some of it probably was, but not all of it. I don't think so. No. He pushed back from the table and stood, which was the thing he did when staying still became impossible. He went to the window and looked out at the drive where the carriage tracks were still visible in the frost. If I'd been alone much longer, he said, I would have sold, eventually, or defaulted. Either way, she'd have gotten the spring. Yes. And now? Maris looked at the notes. Now we document everything, carefully. Every assessment, every comparison, every piece of correspondence. We make a record that tells its own story clearly enough that it doesn't need us to interpret it for anyone. You think there's more? I think someone who has been this patient and this careful has been careful in more than one direction. The tax assessments are the part we can see. I want to know what we can't see yet. He turned from the window. What do you need? I need to get into the county land records. I need to see the survey documents for every parcel surrounding this property going back 20 years. Briggs controls access to the records office. Then I need to find another way in. She tapped the pen against the paper. Do you know anyone at the county seat who isn't inside whatever arrangement Briggs has with Mercer? Rhett thought about it. There's a woman at the territorial records office, Edna Pratt. She's been there longer than anyone, longer than Briggs. She doesn't like him much, as far as I can tell. How do you know that? She told me once, back when I filed the deed on this property. Said she'd seen his kind before and they always ended up overreaching. He paused. She's direct. I like her already. Maris folded the notes. I want to write to her. Today, if possible. He didn't argue. He went to the shelf and brought her the writing paper without being asked, which told her something, that he was adjusting to her, in the unconscious way that people adjust when they've decided to let someone move into their way of thinking. She wrote the letter that evening. It was careful and professional and told Edna Pratt exactly enough to be interesting without revealing what she was actually looking for, because she'd learned from her father that you never show your full hand before you know what cards the other person is holding. She sealed it and set it by the door for morning. Oh, what happened next came from a direction she wasn't watching. 3 days after Vivian's visit, a man named Holt appeared at the edge of the property. Not at the gate. He came across the east pasture on a horse that was walking slowly enough to be deliberately non-threatening, and he stopped at the fence line and called out before he came any closer. Rhett was there first. Maris arrived 2 minutes later, reading his posture from 20 yards away. Not relaxed, but not alarmed. Wary in the controlled way. Holt was a hired hand of some kind, mid-30s, with the worn look of a man who'd spent too many years doing other people's work in bad weather. He held his hat in his hands. Mr. Ashbourne. Mrs. Ashbourne. He nodded at both of them, which Maris noted. I'm not here officially, I want to say that first. Then say what you're here for, Rhett said. I work for the Mercer operation, have for 6 years. He looked at his hat. I need you to know that I'm not comfortable with some of what I've been asked to do recently. I'm not going to tell you specifics. I got a family and I need this job. But I thought you should know that there are men coming and going at night on the road that borders your east pasture. I don't know what they're planning, but it started the day after Mrs. Mercer paid you a visit. Silence. Why are you telling us this? Maris asked. Holt looked at her directly. Because I knew your father, ma'am. Slightly. He was decent to me when I was working up north and most people weren't. He was the kind of man that I just thought I owed it to his daughter to say something. She felt the information land somewhere behind her sternum, in the place where her father's letter lived. She breathed steadily. I appreciate that, she said. Genuinely. He nodded, put his hat back on, and turned his horse around. He didn't look back. They stood at the fence line and watched him go, and the east pasture was quiet around them, and the sky was the low gray of a season that hadn't decided yet how hard it intended to be. Men on the east rode at night, Rhett said, since the day after her visit. She moved fast. She's been planning this longer than a week, Maris said. We just became the variable she didn't account for. Rhett looked at the empty pasture for a long moment. What do we do? She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about the ledger, tracing the movement, watching where things flowed. We keep working, she said. We don't let her see us change anything. We act like we don't know. And we document, and we write to Edna Pratt, and we build our case quietly while she builds her pressure loudly. And if her pressure gets worse than loud? She looked at him steadily. Then we make sure that when it does, we've already done enough, that the evidence survives whatever she does next. He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his face that was difficult to name. Not admiration exactly, not the condescending kind. Something more like recognition. Like a man who'd been alone in a storm for a long time and was only now registering that there was someone standing beside him in it. He turned and walked back toward the barn. She stood for a moment longer in the cold, watching the place where Holt's horse had disappeared into the tree line, and felt the particular weight of a fight that hasn't started yet but has already sent its intentions ahead. She was not afraid. She was something more useful than afraid. She was paying attention. Edna Pratt's reply arrived 8 days later, in an envelope with the Territorial Records Office seal, written in a hand so precise it looked typeset. Mrs. Ashbourne, your inquiry is noted with interest. I have pulled the survey documents you referenced. There are irregularities. I think you should come in person. Some things are better discussed than written. Come on a Tuesday, when Mr. Briggs has his standing appointment in the county seat. Pratt Maris read it twice. Then she read it to Rhett at the supper table. He set down his fork. She's protecting herself. She's being careful, which is the same thing. She knows what she's found and she knows it's significant and she doesn't want a paper trail that connects her to us until she's decided what she's willing to do. Can we trust her? I think she's been watching Briggs operate for 20 years and has been waiting for someone to come along with a reason to do something about it. Maris folded the letter. I think we're that reason. That could be a long drive for something that doesn't pan out. It could be. She looked at him. But she didn't have to write back at all, and she didn't have to tell us to come on a Tuesday specifically. She gave us information she didn't have to give us. That costs her something. He was quiet. Then, when's the nearest Tuesday? 4 days. Road'll be rough. Weather's moving in from the northwest. I know. I'll drive, he said, and went back to his supper. She looked at the letter for another moment, at Edna Pratt's precise, careful handwriting, and thought about all the things that precise and careful people knew and couldn't say and were waiting for the right moment to make useful. 4 days. She could wait 4 days. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, that night at the supper table with the wind starting to build outside and the fire keeping the kitchen warm, was that 4 days was also enough time for someone who was running out of patience to stop being subtle. And when the night came that changed everything, it wouldn't be a boot print at the gate or a carriage coming up the drive or a hired hand at the fence line warning them with his hat in his hands. It would be the smell of smoke. The smell reached her before the sound did. Maris had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when something pulled her up from it. Not a noise, not a voice, but a quality in the air that her body recognized before her mind caught up. Sharp and wrong and ancient in the way that certain warnings are ancient, written into people before language existed to describe them. She was at the window before she was fully awake. The barn was on fire. Not starting to burn, already burning, the way something burns when it has been helped. The east wall was fully involved, orange light pushing hard against the black sky, and even through the closed window she could hear it now, the deep and hungry sound that fire makes when it has found something it likes. She was down the stairs in 8 seconds. She didn't stop for her coat. She hit the front door and screamed Rhett's name at the same moment she saw him already crossing the yard at a run, and for one terrible second she thought he was running toward the barn without thinking, the way people run toward disasters before they've calculated the cost. "The horses," he said, not stopping. She ran after him. "How many are in there?" "4, maybe 5. Decker's mare is still in the east stall." The heat was something she felt from 30 feet away. A wall of it, pressing against her face and hands, and the light was extraordinary in the wrong way, the kind of brightness that has no business existing at this hour in this place. The barn doors were already warped from the heat, the old iron hinges doing something they weren't designed to do. Rhett didn't hesitate. He pulled his jacket over his head, hauled the door open 6 inches, a billow of smoke and superheated air hit them both, and forced himself through the gap. "Rhett!" He was already inside. She stood there for 2 seconds that felt like something longer, listening to the horses screaming in a register she had never heard horses make before and hoped to never hear again. And then she turned and ran for the well. She didn't have a plan. She had pieces of one. She had a bucket and a well, and the knowledge that one person with one bucket would not stop this barn from burning, and she needed other people. She grabbed the bucket from the well post and threw water on the feed shed attached to the barn's south wall, the one that hadn't caught yet, and then she ran toward the road. Their nearest neighbor was the Granger family, half a mile east. She ran. The frozen ground was uneven under her bare feet, and she registered the pain distantly, the way you register things that matter less than the thing you're actually trying to do. She reached the Granger property in a time she couldn't account for and hammered on the door until Len Granger appeared in his long underwear with a lantern and a rifle, both of which he lowered when he saw her. "Fire," she said. "Ashbourne Barn. We need everyone you can send." He was already turning. Clara, get up and ring the bell." The Grangers had a triangle bell on their fence post, the kind that carried across the valley on still nights. Maris heard it start behind her as she ran back. By the time she returned, Rhett had gotten 3 horses out. They were loose in the yard, moving in distressed circles, and he was coming back out of the barn with his arm around the neck of the 4th, half leading, half dragging a mare who was out of her mind with panic and fighting him every step. His jacket was gone. His shirt was scorched along the right shoulder in a way that meant the fabric had been close enough to flame to matter. He got the mare through the door, and she immediately pulled free of him and ran, and he let her go because there was nothing else to do, and he bent forward with his hands on his knees and coughed for a long time. "Decker's mare," Maris said. He shook his head. She understood. She pressed her hand briefly to his back, not comfort, exactly, or not only comfort, but something more instinctive than that, and then straightened and looked at the barn, which was fully gone now in any meaningful sense. The roof would come down within the hour. The walls were following it. The Grangers arrived in 12 minutes with 2 of their sons and a wagon. The Purcell family came 8 minutes after that. Someone else came, and someone else, until there were 14 people in the yard, and Maris organized them with the focused efficiency of a person who has run out of room for anything that isn't the immediate problem. She put 6 people on the feed shed, passing buckets from the well, and a secondary trough near the fence. She put 4 people on the east side of the house, wetting it down, because the wind had shifted and she'd done the calculation in her head, and the wind was now the biggest danger after the barn itself. She put 2 people on watching for spread to the dry grass along the north fence, where a single ember in the wrong place would give them an entirely different problem. She worked alongside all of them. She didn't stand apart and direct. She passed buckets and shouted instructions and ran the 30 feet between the well and the shed until her arms stopped feeling like arms and became something more mechanical, something that simply continued because stopping wasn't a choice she was making right now. By the time the eastern sky started lightening, the barn was rubble and ash, and the smell of it was everywhere. In her hair, her clothes, the back of her throat. But the feed shed was standing. The house was standing. The Decker mare was the only loss they hadn't been able to prevent. And that was a grief of its own kind, quiet and heavy. The kind that sits on you after the emergency is over and you've stopped moving enough to feel things again. Len Granger pressed Rhett's hand before he left. His wife wrapped a blanket around Maris's shoulders and looked at her with the expression of a woman revising a previous opinion. "You did good," Clara Granger said. "Is this?" "Everybody did good," Maris said. "Everybody followed you." Clara pulled the blanket tighter, with the particular authority of an older woman who is not offering a choice. "That's different." Maris was too tired to argue. She said thank you and meant it. Rhett sat on the porch steps when everyone had gone, with a tin cup of water he wasn't drinking, looking at the place where the barn had been. The smoke was still rising in thin columns from the rubble, gray against the gray of early morning, and the smell wasn't going anywhere soon. She sat down next to him, not close, not far. "The hay," he said. "Most of it. We had enough stored for the winter." "I know." He was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but its opposite. So full of what wasn't being said that silence became the only container that would hold it. "This wasn't an accident," he said. He didn't ask it. "No." "The fire started on the east wall." "Yes." "The east wall faces the east road, where Holt said there were men coming and going at night." She didn't say anything, because he was working through it in his own order, and she wasn't going to interrupt that. "Someone was out there," he said, "in the dark, with a reason." He finally drank from the cup. "This was because of me, because she wanted me to sell, and I wouldn't. It's because of the spring. You're right about that part." She paused. "But you need to hear the other part too." He looked at her. "She did this because she thought you were still alone. She thought you were a man with debt and no family and no one in your corner, and that something like this would be the thing that finally broke you." She held his gaze. "She didn't count on what's changed." He was very still. "What's changed?" he said quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. "She came to this property expecting to find a man at the end of his rope who would sell. She found something else." He looked back at the ruins of the barn for a long moment. "Most women would want to leave after this. I'm not leaving. I know." He said it simply, not with relief, something steadier than relief. "I just wanted to say it, so you knew I knew it." They sat in the early morning cold until the last of the smoke columns died down, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. Maris went back to the burn site at mid-morning after Rhett had ridden out to check the remaining livestock, and she was alone. She went deliberately, with purpose, carrying nothing but her notebook, and the particular kind of attention she'd learned from years of reading documents. The ability to look at something and ask what it was telling you before you decided what you thought about it. The east wall had burned hottest. That was visible in the debris. The timber there had gone to fine ash rather than the larger char pieces that remained from other sections. She crouched at the edge of the rubble and studied the burn pattern without touching anything. Hot, fast, concentrated in one place before spreading. She walked the fence line along the east side, 30 feet from the debris, moving slowly. The ground here was harder than the yard, frozen and compressed by whatever traffic the east road carried, and that made it worse for reading. But not impossible. She found the first thing 20 feet from the barn's east corner, a depression in the frost-hardened mud just outside the fence line, the kind of depression a boot heel makes when a man shifts his weight while standing in one place long enough to matter. Around it, smaller marks, the toe of the boot, and beside it, another print, the outer edge of a second boot, slightly different tread. 2 people, standing here, together, for long enough to leave marks. She noted it, moved on. The second thing was harder to find and more important. It was caught on the bottom fence rail, which was the rail closest to the ground, a scrap of fabric that had been there long enough to collect frost on its exposed surface. She crouched down and looked at it without touching it for a full minute before she took it between two fingers and held it to the morning light. Wool. Dark gray, almost charcoal. The weave was a medium weight, the kind used for working coats rather than dress coats. A fragment about 2 inches long, caught on the fence nail by the fraying end, which meant it had been pulled from a coat by someone moving in a hurry. Someone who'd been close to this fence in the dark, moving fast, going away rather than toward. Running. She took the fabric fragment and placed it carefully in the back of her notebook, pressed between 2 pages. Then she walked the east road itself, moving north from the barn, looking for anything else the night had left behind. She found the bottle at the edge of the road, 20 yards north of the fence corner, half buried in the frost by the wheel rut. It was a small oil bottle, the commercial kind that hardware suppliers stocked, still smelling faintly of kerosene. Someone had dropped it or thrown it from a moving horse, and it had landed in the rut and been partially covered by the frozen mud thrown up by hooves. She picked it up carefully by the base. Thought about it. The bottle was a connection. The fabric was a connection. The boot prints were a connection. None of them were enough by themselves, and all of them together told a story that was harder to deny than each piece alone. She stood on the east road in the cold morning with an oil bottle in her hand and looked north along the road toward where it curved and disappeared and eventually connected to the Mercer property's southern boundary. And she thought about Vivian Mercer's smile and the careful way she'd said the debt structure and the precisely calibrated warmth of a woman who had been operating this way for so long that it had become her natural register. Then she walked back to the house and put the bottle and the notebook in the locked chest under her bed, which she'd bought specifically for this kind of purpose, and she sat down at the table and began to write. The trip to the county seat couldn't wait for Tuesday anymore. She told Rhett that evening after supper, laying out what she'd found in the order she'd found it. He listened the way he'd learned to listen to her, without interrupting, without jumping to conclusions, following the chain. When she finished, he looked at the description of the fabric fragment and the kerosene bottle. "You preserved all of it," he said. "Yes." "You went out there thinking like—" He stopped. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father kept meticulous records of everything on his property. When there was a dispute with a neighboring claim one year, boundary markers moved, which was common enough. He documented the original survey so carefully that the other man's claim fell apart in 30 minutes. He said that the person who writes things down almost always wins against the person who doesn't." She looked at her notes. "I learned that before I learned anything else about land management. We need to tell the sheriff." She was quiet for a moment. This was the part she'd been thinking about all day, turning it from different angles. "Not yet," she said. He frowned. "Someone burned my barn." "I know, and Sheriff Bale needs to hear about it, but I want to go to Edna Pratt first. I want to see what those land records show before we walk into Bale's office, because if there's a larger pattern, if Vivian has done this to other properties, other people, over the years, then we don't walk in there with one incident. We walk in there with a history." He worked that through. "You think Bale would dismiss one incident? I think one incident involving a wealthy woman with significant political connections in this county is easy to manage if you're the sheriff, and the alternative is making that woman your enemy. I think a documented pattern across multiple properties and multiple years is considerably harder to set aside." He sat back. "She's done this to others. I think she's been accumulating land and influence in this valley for 20 years, and I don't think the Ashbourne property is the first place she's applied pressure. I think we might be the first people who pushed back in a way she couldn't immediately resolve." He stared at the ceiling for a moment. "We need to go to the county seat. Tomorrow. Not Tuesday. Tomorrow. The road is—" "I know what the road is." He looked at her. "I'll get the wagon ready at first light." They left before sunrise. The road was exactly what he'd warned her it would be, frozen solid in places, unpredictably soft in others, and in 2 spots where the grade dropped toward the creek crossing, a challenge that required Rhett to manage the horses with a concentration that left no room for conversation. Maris sat beside him with the locked chest on her lap and used the travel time to do the only productive thing available to her, which was think. She was building the structure of the argument in her head. Not the emotional version, not the version that was about a burned barn and a dead horse and a woman who'd smiled and hinted at debt structures over a kitchen table. The documented version, the one that didn't need her to be angry to be persuasive. The kind that stood on its own. What she had: irregular tax assessments running 4 years, documented against county averages. A land holdings pattern that showed progressive acquisition around the mountain spring. The testimony of Holt, who was informal but who might be willing to say more under the right circumstances. Physical evidence from the fire site. And whatever Edna Pratt had found in the survey documents, which had been significant enough to bring them in person. What she needed: the survey documents themselves, which might show boundary manipulations. Prior incidents on other properties, if they existed. And some connection, any connection, between the pattern and Vivian Mercer specifically, rather than the general atmosphere of misfortune that could always be attributed to hard times and bad luck. The county seat was a larger town than Cutter's Bend, 2 stories on most of the buildings, and a proper courthouse with pillars that looked slightly out of place this far into the territory. The Territorial Records Office was in a building adjacent to the courthouse, easily identified by the stacks of document boxes visible through its front windows, and the general atmosphere of a place that took its own organization very seriously. Edna Pratt was exactly what Maris had expected from the letter. A woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair pinned with great efficiency and the posture of someone who had spent decades refusing to let the world make her smaller. She looked at them both when they came in, assessed the situation in approximately 3 seconds, and said, "You're early," which wasn't an objection. "Something happened," Maris said. "Our barn." Edna looked at Rhett's scorched shirt collar, which he hadn't been able to fully scrub the marks from, and she closed the front office and locked the door and put the close sign up without asking another question. She led them to the back room, which was lined floor to ceiling with document boxes in a system that only she could navigate, and which she navigated with the ease of someone who had designed it herself. She'd laid 5 files on the long table already, waiting. "I've been expecting someone to come in about this for several years," she said, sitting down and folding her hands on the table. "I had begun to believe no one was going to." Maris sat across from her. Rhett stood near the door, not from suspicion, but because sitting still wasn't available to him at the moment, and she'd come to understand this about him. "Tell me what you found," Maris said. Edna opened the first file. 3 years before Rhett Ashbourne purchased his current property, there was an original homestead filing on the parcel immediately to the north of it, family named Ashford. They filed correctly, paid their fees, and began improvement within the required period. She slid a document across the table. 18 months later, their filing was voided on the grounds that a prior survey showed the parcel had already been incorporated into the Mercer holdings. Maris looked at the document. And had it been? The prior survey was filed by a surveyor named Gerald Hune, who worked exclusively for Mercer operations during that period and has not worked for anyone else, before or since. Edna opened the second file. Hune's survey shows the Mercer boundary running approximately 800 yards further east than any previous or subsequent survey of the same land. That additional 800 yards encompasses the Ashford parcel entirely. Rhett made a sound from the doorway that wasn't quite a word. "The Ashfords appealed," Edna continued. "The appeal went to the county land board." She slid another document. J. Colton Brigg was appointed to the county land board 11 months before this case came before it. The appeal was denied. Maris looked at the documents in order. The filing, the fraudulent survey, the board membership, the denial. It was a machine, simple and well-designed and almost invisible from the outside, because each piece looked like ordinary bureaucratic process unless you knew what you were looking for. "How many times," she said. "That I can document directly? 4 properties over 12 years. 2 families left the territory entirely. 1 man sold to Mercer at a price I suspect was well below market, under what I'm told was significant social pressure. 1 property." Edna paused, and something moved in her face that wasn't quite sadness but was in that territory. 1 property had a fire, 3 years ago. The family lost their main structure. They sold within the month. The room was very quiet. "A fire," Maris said. "Yes." "What property?" "The Dunbar place, southeast boundary of the Mercer holdings, between her east pasture and the main road." Edna looked at her steadily. The Dunbar property controls the only road access to the water table feeding the mountain spring that runs through your ranch, Mrs. Ashbourne. Maris sat back very slowly. She thought about the oil bottle in her chest. She thought about the 2 boot prints at the fence line. She thought about Holt with his hat in his hand saying, "There are men coming and going at night." "They've done this before," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "And no one has brought it together before now?" "No one has had reason to sit in front of me with the right questions." Edna's voice was dry, but not unkind. "Most people, when they lose a property and leave the territory, are not in a position to investigate what happened to them. And the people who remain are—" She chose her next word with care. "Cautious." Maris thought about the silence on the main street in Cutter's Bend, the way people's expressions rearranged themselves, the 2 men exchanging a look by the feed store. Not hostility, caution. The specific caution of people who knew what came from attracting the wrong kind of attention. "I need copies of everything you can give me," Maris said. "I've already made them." Edna indicated a second stack of documents Maris hadn't noticed yet, neatly organized and tied with string. "I want to say something to you, Mrs. Ashbourne, if I may." "Please." "What I've given you is significant, but it will not be enough on its own. Documents can be challenged. Surveyors can claim honest error. Board decisions can be defended on procedural grounds." She looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who had no more patience for anything less than honesty. "What you need is a witness, someone with direct knowledge who is willing to say it openly." Holt. The name went through Maris's mind like something dropping into cold water. "I may have one," she said. "Then that's your next problem." Edna stood. "I need you both gone before Briggs returns from the county seat. He has an arrangement with the woman at the front desk, and I can't promise she won't mention you've been here." They left with the document package under Maris's arm, and the locked chest, and a drive back that felt different from the drive in, heavier in one sense, lighter in another, like carrying something that had been invisible and was now material, which changed the weight of it without changing the fact of it. Rhett didn't say much on the way back. He drove, and she sat with the documents on her lap, and the afternoon light dropped behind the mountains, and the temperature fell, and they made the creek crossing in the last of the usable daylight. When the ranch came into view, the house, the standing feed shed, the gap in the landscape where the barn had been, he stopped the horses for a moment. "The Dunbar family," he said. "Fire 3 years ago, southeast boundary." "Yes." "I remember hearing about that. Thought it was a kitchen fire." He paused. "Everybody thought it was a kitchen fire." "That's what it was intended to look like." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many people in this valley have been living with what she's done to them and not known that it was done to them on purpose?" "I don't know yet," she paused. "But I think they know now that they need to." He clicked the horses forward, and they moved down the drive toward the house. And the gate latch lifted the way it always lifted, the same complaint as always, and this time it was just the gate, just the mechanism doing its job. When they got inside, Maris put the documents in the chest with the other evidence and locked it, and put it in the corner of her room and stood looking at it for a moment. She was tired in a way that went down to something deeper than muscle. The kind of tired that comes from fear that you've been holding in productive form for too long, kept organized and operational, when what it actually wanted was to just be fear for a while. She allowed herself 10 minutes of it, sitting on the edge of her bed, letting her hands shake slightly now that there was no one watching who needed her to be steady. Then she got up and went downstairs and helped Rhett make supper, because the day wasn't done, and neither were they. And the evidence in the chest was powerful but fragile, and the one thing they couldn't afford was to stop moving now that they'd started. The Dunbar fire. Holt's hat in his hands. Edna Pratt's copies, tied with string. And tomorrow, and all the days that came after it, as many as it took, she was going to build something out of those pieces that not even Vivian Mercer could make disappear. She was certain of it in the way her father had always described certainty. Not the feeling that you couldn't fail, but the decision that failure wasn't something you were going to let happen without a fight that made it cost. She put the water on to boil and began slicing the bread, and outside the wind moved through the dark valley, and the mountain spring ran cold and clear somewhere above them on the ridge, running the same way it had always run, indifferent to who claimed to own it, waiting to see who was still standing when the argument was finished. Holt came to the fence line again on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the fire. Maris saw him from the kitchen window before Rhett did. The slow walk of a horse that was being held to a deliberate pace, and the particular way the man in the saddle was sitting, upright but careful, the way a person sits when they're doing something that costs them something, and they haven't finished deciding if the price is right. She put on her coat and went out before Rhett came down from checking the roof repair on the feed shed. Holt stopped at the fence line and waited for her, hat already in his hands. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of winter day that was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful. It didn't care what was happening on the ground beneath it. Mrs. Ashbourne. Mr. Holt. He looked at the gap where the barn had been. The foundation stones still dark with char, the debris mostly cleared now, but the absence of the structure impossible to ignore. His jaw tightened. I heard, he said. Yes. I want to say... He stopped, started again. I didn't know they were going to do that. I knew something was being planned, but I didn't know the nature of it, and I want you to understand that if I had known, I would have... I believe you, she said. He looked at her, like he'd prepared for a different response and wasn't sure what to do with that one. You said before that you weren't willing to say specifics, she said, because of your family. I understand that. I'm not here to ask you to risk something you can't afford to risk. She paused. But I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. All right. The fire on the Dunbar property, 3 years ago. Were you working for Mercer then? Something moved across his face, old and heavy, the look of a man who'd been carrying something that had gotten heavier with time rather than lighter. Yes, he said. Were you there? No. He said it quickly, and she believed that too. There was a specific quality to the denial, the kind that comes from someone drawing a clear line in their own history. I wasn't there, but I knew the men who were, and I knew what the story was going to be before anybody told it. Kitchen fire, she said. Kitchen fire. He said it like it tasted bad. She looked at him for a moment. The wind moved through the dead grass along the fence line, and neither of them acknowledged it. If there was a formal investigation, she said carefully, if there was someone with authority asking questions, not just us, would you be willing to give a statement about what you knew? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't push it, just let the question sit where she'd put it. My wife's expecting, he said finally. The baby comes in April. I know that matters. It matters more than most things. Yes. He turned his hat around in his hands twice. If someone with real authority was asking, not bail, someone above bail, and if there was some assurance that what happened to the Dunbar family and what happened to your barn would actually be addressed rather than quietly buried, he stopped. Then maybe. I'd need to think about it seriously, but maybe. It was not a yes, but it was something that could become a yes under the right conditions, and that was more than she'd had when she woke up this morning. Thank you, she said. That's honest, and I appreciate it. You're going to go after her, he said. Not a question. Yes. He nodded slowly. Your father would have. He put his hat back on. I'll think about what I said. If something moves on this, if it gets real, you can send word to the Mercer bunkhouse. Leave it with the young man named Pepper. He's not in any of this, and he'll get a message to me quietly. He turned his horse and walked it back the way he'd come. Red appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him cross the yard. How long were you standing there? She said. Long enough. She turned and walked back toward the house. Then you heard what we need. What they needed, she explained to Rhett over the kitchen table that afternoon, was someone above Sheriff Bale. Someone with territorial authority, not county authority, because the county authority was compromised. Briggs ran the land board. Bale had been in office through 12 years of Vivian Mercer's operations without apparently finding anything worth investigating, and the visible center of gravity in the county pulled toward Mercer's interests in ways that were probably not all financial, but were all effective. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office was in the capital. That was 4 days by stage. You're going yourself, Rhett said. It wasn't a question either. He'd gotten better at reading her in the weeks since she'd arrived. I need to go in person. These documents, she touched the stack on the table, need someone to present them who understands what they say and can answer questions. A letter can be ignored. A person in the office is harder to ignore. And the ranch? You can manage for a week. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, specifically at the document stack, with the expression of a man who was working through something and hadn't found the right words for it yet. "Say it," she said. "You'd be going to the Capitol alone, with evidence that implicates a woman who already burned our barn." He looked up. "If she finds out you're there, she won't know why I'm there. I'll take the stage from the county seat, not from Cutter's Bend. There's no reason for anyone here to know. People talk." "Then I'll be quick." She paused. "I've thought through the risks. I'm not being reckless." "I know you're not." He said it quietly, without the edge of argument. He stopped again. She waited. "I haven't had anyone in this house worth worrying about for a long time," he said. "I'm out of practice at it. It feels bad." She held his gaze for a moment. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her since they'd started whatever this was, and it sat in the air between them with a weight she didn't entirely know what to do with. "I'll be back inside a week," she said. "I'll send word when I reach the Capitol. I'll start on the barn frame while you're gone. Len Granger offered his sons." "That's good. We'll need hay before January. I can work the Millhaven contact you set up, the one with the better rate." "Yes, you have the letter with his terms." "I do." He folded his hands on the table. "You're going to the Capitol, and I'm building a barn and buying hay." "That's about right." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, the particular expression of a man finding something wry in a situation that doesn't deserve it. "Your father said you turned out better than anything he could have planned," he said. She looked down at the documents. "He was biased." "Maybe, but he was also right." She didn't answer that, but she didn't dismiss it either, which was as close to accepting a compliment as she generally got. She left on a Monday, before sunrise. In the wagon, Rhett drove to the county seat stage stop. They didn't talk much on the way. They'd done their talking the night before, going through the documents one more time, making sure she had everything organized, making sure she knew the arguments she needed to make in what order. At the stage stop, he handed her carpet bag down from the wagon, and she took it, and they stood for a moment in the half-dark with the stage horses stamping in the cold and the other passengers waiting with their own preoccupations. "Maris," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be deciding something, or had already decided it, and was deciding whether to say it. "Come back," he said finally. Plain as that. Not dramatic, just direct. "I'm planning on it," she said. And then she got on the stage. She watched him through the window as the stage moved out. He stood at the stop until the distance made him small, and then the road curved, and he was gone. She turned to face forward and opened her notebook and began reviewing what she was going to say to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. The Capitol was larger and louder than she'd expected, and colder, which she hadn't thought was possible, but the elevation made it true. She found a boarding house near the government district, a clean and practical place run by a woman named Mrs. Fenn, who asked no questions and served hot meals twice a day, which was everything Maris needed. She went to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office the next morning. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with the careful manner of someone new enough to his position that he still took it seriously, which she considered a good sign. She asked to speak with someone in the investigation division. He told her there wasn't an investigation division as such. She told him she had documentation concerning fraudulent land surveys and potential arson in Cutter's Bend County, and she needed to speak with whoever handled that category of matter. He went away for 11 minutes. When he came back, he brought a man named Gerald Foss. Foss was 50s, tired-looking, with the organized desk of a man who handled complex problems for a living and had made peace with the fact that complex problems were infinite. He looked at her the way someone looks at a document they haven't opened yet, reserving judgment until they've read what's in it. "You have documentation," he said. Not skeptically, but not the opposite either. "Quite a lot of it," she said. "May I sit down?" He gestured to the chair across his desk. She put the document package on the desk and began. She presented it the way she'd planned it, not emotionally, not with the story of the burned barn first, but with the foundation. The survey documents that showed Gerald Hune's fraudulent boundary revision. The property tax records showing the Ashbourne parcel's systematic overassessment relative to comparable land. The timeline of Mercer acquisitions relative to the cases where legitimate filings had been voided. The Ashford case. 2 other cases from Edna Pratt's records. The Dunbar property. Foss read while she talked. He was a good reader, quick and thorough, not performative. He turned pages at the right pace for someone who was actually absorbing them rather than appearing to. When she reached the fire evidence, the physical description of what she'd found, the documented connection to the East Road and the Mercer operation, the testimony she expected from Holt if a formal inquiry provided the right conditions, he looked up for the first time. "You collected the physical evidence yourself," he said. "Yes." "The morning after the fire?" "Yes." "You documented it before touching it?" "I have written descriptions of the location and condition of each item before I moved it." She produced the notebook, dated and timed. He looked at the notebook for a long moment. "You're not a lawyer, Mrs. Ashbourne." "No." "You're a rancher's wife." She met his eyes. "I'm a co-owner of a property that someone tried to take, and I've been keeping books and reading land records since I was 14 years old." She paused. "The two things are not mutually exclusive." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "The witness," he said, "the Mercer employee. Has he committed to a statement?" "He's committed to considering it, if a formal inquiry provides him reasonable assurance his family won't suffer for it. He was explicit about his conditions." "That's a soft commitment." "It's an honest one. He has a pregnant wife, and he's told us what he knows at personal risk already." She held Foss's gaze. "If your office opens a formal inquiry, that changes his calculation. Right now, his only protection from Mercer is saying nothing. If there's a territorial investigation, saying nothing stops protecting him and becomes its own risk." Foss leaned back in his chair. He looked at the documents on his desk, the organized stack, the notebook, the careful progression of evidence she'd laid out. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he said. "About 6 weeks from the day I arrived at the property." "And before that?" "My father taught me. My whole life, one way or another." She thought of Henry's handwriting on the last letter, the loose letters leaning right. "She's the finest person I ever raised." He believed in documentation. He said it was the only weapon available to people who weren't powerful. Foss was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to need to keep these documents." "I have copies." "Of course you do." He said it without irony, almost with appreciation. "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Ashbourne. What you've brought me is significant, more significant than most things that come through that door." He tapped the edge of the stack. "But I also want to be honest that an investigation into Vivian Mercer's operations in Cutter's Bend County is going to encounter resistance. She has connections at the territorial level, not just the county level." "I know. It won't move fast." "I understand that. And there will be—" he chose his words. "There may be an attempt to discredit the process. The source of the complaint. You." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of attempt?" "Questions about the validity of your property standing, the circumstances of your marriage, whether you have actual legal authority to bring this complaint." He said it directly, without apology, which she appreciated. These are the kinds of questions that get raised when powerful people feel threatened by the process. "Then we make sure the process is unimpeachable." She said it without heat. "Every document I've given you is an original or a certified copy from a public records office. The tax assessments are public records. The survey documents are filed instruments. The evidence from the fire was documented before I touched it." She paused. "My name is on the deed to that property. It has been since 3 weeks after I arrived. Anyone who wants to question my standing is going to have to challenge a legally filed deed in front of the same territorial authorities they're trying to influence." Foss studied her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I'll take this to my director today. I want to discuss it with him before I make any commitments about the scope of an inquiry." "That's reasonable? Can you stay in the capital until tomorrow?" "Yes." "Come back at 10 in the morning." He stood, she stood, and he extended his hand across the desk, which she shook. "I have to say, Mrs. Ashbourne, in 17 years in this office, I have not seen a private citizen walk in with this quality of prepared evidence." She picked up her notebook and her bag. "My father would have been pleased to hear that." She didn't say it with emotion, but she meant it with all of it. The director's name was Harold Ashby, and he was a man who had been in territorial government long enough to know the difference between a complaint that would go nowhere and one that had the specific gravity of real documentation behind it. He met with Maris the next morning for 40 minutes, asked 14 questions, all of them precise, and told her at the end that the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office would open a formal preliminary inquiry into land survey practices in Cutter's Bend County within the next 30 days. Preliminary, she said, to determine the scope of a full investigation. Yes. He looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Ashbourne, I want to manage your expectations. This process could take months. It will require your cooperation as a complainant and likely your testimony, and there is no guarantee. I understand all of that, she said. I just needed someone to open the door. He nodded slowly. The door is open. She took the stage back the next day. Well, the ride back was different from the ride out. The documents were filed. The inquiry was coming. She had done what she'd gone to do, and the fatigue that settled into her on the stage was a different quality from the fatigue of the past weeks, less like pressure and more like something releasing. She let herself be tired, properly tired, not the managed kind. She thought about her father, about the way he'd sat on the porch in the last months, when the effort of getting up and doing things had become a separate category of challenge from the things themselves. And he'd watched the land with the expression of a man trying to memorize something he knew he was going to lose access to. She thought about what she was building, what she'd arrived with nothing to build it with except her father's letter, and $17, and the particular stubbornness of a person who had decided that the word no was a direction rather than a wall. What she had now was different. The property had a legitimate future, not just surviving, but actually moving forward. The hay supply was being managed, the livestock rotation was working, the finances were beginning to reflect what competent management actually looked like when applied consistently. And she had Rhett. Not the way she'd been taught to think about having a husband, not the version of that which required a specific kind of feeling to be legitimate. She had him in the way that mattered in practice. A man who listened when she talked and worked when she asked, and had said, "Come back in the dark of a stage stop morning," with the plain simplicity of someone who actually meant it. She wasn't ready to examine what that was exactly. She wasn't in the habit of rushing toward things she didn't have language for yet. But she was aware of it, the way you're aware of a change in the weather. Not always consciously, but in the way your body holds itself differently when something in the air has shifted. I was at the gate when the wagon from the stage stop came up the road. Not waiting in an obvious way, he was working the fence line near the entrance, which could have been coincidence, except that she knew him well enough now to know it wasn't coincidence. He'd been listening for the wagon. She climbed down before the driver could offer assistance, and Rhett came to the fence and looked at her. "It went well?" he said. "Better than I expected." She picked up her bag. "They're opening a formal inquiry. 30 days. Something moved across his face. Relief, but not simple relief. The kind that's complicated by months of wait preceding it. "You did that?" he said. "We have more to do before it's over." "I know, but you did that." She walked through the gate and he closed it behind her, and they walked toward the house together in the cold afternoon. And she told him everything, Foss, Ashby, the questions they'd asked, the conditions they'd set, what the inquiry meant and what it didn't mean yet. The barn frame was up. The Granger boys had worked fast. The skeleton of the new structure stood against the sky where the old one had burned, raw lumber pale in the winter light, not finished, but real, functional in its beginnings. She stopped and looked at it. "Len's sons are good workers," Rhett said, stopping beside her. "It's faster than I expected." "I told them what happened." He paused. "I told them what I thought happened, about Mercer, about the fire. I didn't have proof to give them, but Len Granger has been ranching in this valley for 30 years, and he has his own opinions about certain patterns." He looked at the frame. "He said his family would help build the barn. He didn't say why exactly, but his son worked 3 days straight." Maris thought about Edna Pratt's description of the valley. The people who knew and stayed careful, who absorbed what happened to them without entirely understanding why, who attributed things to bad luck, because the alternative required a confrontation they didn't have the tools for. The tools were coming now. "Len should know about the inquiry," she said, "when it's confirmed." "Yes, when it's confirmed. And others too. Anyone who's had irregular tax assessments or boundary disputes in the past 10 years. They should know what Edna Pratt found and what's coming." She looked at the barn frame. "Because this wasn't only about us." He was quiet for a moment. "No, it wasn't. And the people who lost and left, the Ashfords, the Dunbars, They should know what was done to them wasn't misfortune. Can they come back? Their land? I don't know yet. That depends on how the inquiry goes and what gets reopened. She paused. But they should know. Even if nothing can be undone, they should know the truth of what happened to them. He looked at her with that expression she'd seen more and more in recent weeks. The one she still didn't have an exact name for but recognized by now. Like a man looking at something he hadn't known he needed and was only now realizing how long the absence of it had cost him. The inquiry is going to make things harder before it makes them easier, he said. Vivian is going to find out. When she does, I know. She's going to come at us. Whatever she's done before, she'll do more. I know that too. I want to be ready for it this time. He said it with a steadiness that had nothing to do with bravado, just the plain statement of a man who'd made a decision about what he was willing to do. I've spent years, a long time, trying to stay small enough that trouble would pass over me. That didn't work, and I knew it didn't work, and I kept doing it anyway. He looked at her. I'm done with that. She held his gaze. Good. Whatever comes next, I'm here for it. I know, she said. And she did know. That was the thing about trust that she hadn't entirely expected. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated, like the slow record of a well-kept ledger, line by line, until one day you looked at the total and it was larger than you'd consciously tracked. She went inside and put the kettle on and took the physical evidence from the locked chest and began adding her notes from the capital, what she'd said, what Foss had said, what Ashby's 14 questions had been and how she'd answered them, adding it all to the record, complete and dated, the way her father had taught her. Outside, the wind moved through the barn frame, and the raw lumber creaked softly in the cold. And from somewhere up the ridge, the mountain spring ran on, unhurried, indifferent, waiting. The next letter came 3 days later. It was not from the territorial office. It was from Vivian Mercer. It was written in the same warm and careful hand as everything else Vivian produced, perfectly spelled, perfectly punctuated, the kind of letter that contained nothing that could be directly objected to and communicated everything that mattered through implication alone. It expressed concern that Maris, as a new resident of the valley, might be receiving misleading information about certain land matters from people with their own agendas. Concern that well-meaning but inexperienced parties sometimes disrupted delicate ongoing negotiations in ways that created unfortunate consequences for everyone involved. Concern that the Ashbourne property, which carried certain financial vulnerabilities, would be well served by its owners focusing on their own stability rather than external matters that didn't concern them. At the bottom, in the same measured script, I have always found that direct conversation resolves misunderstandings more effectively than correspondence with outside parties. I hope we might speak soon. Maris read it twice. Then she read it to Rhett. He was quiet for a moment. She knows, he said. Or she suspects. Someone told her I'd traveled. She set the letter down. The front desk clerk at the commissioner's office. Briggs's contact there, whoever it was. What do we do with the letter? She looked at it on the table, the warm, careful handwriting, the velvet around the threat. We keep it, she said. We date it, and we note when it arrived, and we add it to the file. She picked it up. Because when she says outside parties and unfortunate consequences, that's a threat in the language that people like her use for threats. And threats, documented and dated, are evidence. She went to the chest and locked it inside. Vivian Mercer had spent years in this valley being the most prepared person in any given conflict. She was about to discover what it felt like to be second. The 30 days passed like water moving under ice. You could feel the current, but you couldn't see exactly where it was going. Maris kept working. That was the only thing she knew how to do with time she couldn't control, fill it with things she could. She finished the new livestock rotation schedule and implemented it fully. She completed a second pass through 5 years of feed and supply records and identified 3 more areas where costs could be reduced without sacrificing the herd's condition. She wrote detailed notes about every conversation, every letter, every interaction with anyone connected to Mercer or to the county administration, dated and filed with the same precision she'd applied to everything else. Rhett finished the barn with the Granger boys. It wasn't identical to the old one. The new lumber was lighter in color, the proportions slightly different because they'd taken the opportunity to correct a drainage problem the original structure had always had. But it was solid and real, and when Maris stood inside it the first morning after the roof went on, She felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't been able to name as missing until it returned. They didn't celebrate. They just put the horses back in it and went on with the day. Vivian Mercer did not contact them again after the letter. That silence was its own kind of pressure, the kind that made you aware of being watched without being able to point to the watching. Maris heard through Clara Granger, who heard through the web of information that moved through any rural community, whether anyone planned it or not, that Vivian had made several trips to the county seat in the weeks following Maris's return from the capital, that she had met with Briggs, that she had consulted a lawyer, a man brought in from outside the territory. Maris noted all of it. She didn't react to any of it. What she was waiting for came on a cold February morning, a letter with the territorial commissioner's seal, addressed to both Rhett and Maris Ashbourne, informing them that a formal investigation had been opened into land survey practices and property assessment irregularities in Cutter's Bend County, and that an investigator from the commissioner's office would be arriving within the next 2 weeks to begin the process of gathering testimony. She read it at the kitchen table and then set it down and sat with her hands folded on top of it for a moment. Rhett watched her from across the table. Good news or complicated news? Both, she said, which is what real progress looks like. The investigator's name was Thomas Carver, and he arrived on a Tuesday, the same day Briggs had his standing appointment at the county seat, which Maris suspected was not accidental on someone's part. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the kind of precise and unhurried manner that suggested he'd learned early that the people who moved fastest through complicated situations were usually the ones who slowed down enough to read them correctly first. He came to the Ashbourne property first, which also felt deliberate. He spent 3 hours reviewing the documents Maris had compiled, asking questions that were specific and sometimes unexpected, not the obvious questions about what happened and when, but questions about process and sequence and how she'd arrived at each connection. He was testing the integrity of the structure, she understood, not the content. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at the organized stack on the table with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally telling. You didn't miss much, he said. I tried not to. The Ashford case is the clearest. The survey discrepancy is documented from 3 independent sources, and the timeline of Briggs's board appointment is a matter of public record. He picked up one of Edna Pratt's certified copies. Ms. Pratt took some risk providing these. She's been waiting a long time for the right circumstances. She may be called to give formal testimony. She'll do it. She'll do it better than almost anyone. He looked at her. And the physical evidence from the fire. You understand that chain of custody questions will be raised about that. I documented everything before I moved it. I have dated written descriptions and I have the items themselves, preserved. I understand it's not the same as having an official present during collection. She paused. But if Holt gives a statement, the physical evidence becomes corroboration rather than the foundation. It doesn't have to stand alone. You've thought about how this case gets made. I've had time to think about it. Carver was quiet for a moment. Have you spoken with Holt since your initial contact? Once. He's waiting to see if the investigation is real before he commits. He specifically said he needed to see something with actual authority behind it before he'd step forward. She held his gaze. You being here is that something. I'll need to make contact with him through appropriate channels. He said to leave word at the Mercer bunkhouse with a young man named Pepper. He's been clear that he won't approach anyone official on Mercer property directly. The contact needs to come from your side. Carver wrote this down. His handwriting was almost as precise as Edna Pratt's, which she considered a good sign. There are also other families you should speak with, she said. The Grangers have been in this valley 30 years. They have their own observations about the pattern, even if they don't have documentation. And there are names in Edna Pratt's records, former residents who may have left the territory but who might be willing to correspond if they understood what was being investigated. The Ashfords. And others. Edna can give you the names. He closed his notebook. Mrs. Ashbourne, I want to be direct with you about what this investigation can and cannot do. What you've brought us is a strong foundation, but an investigation of this scope will take time, months, not weeks. During that time, you should expect that the opposing side will be working as well. There may be attempts to discredit witnesses, to challenge document authenticity, to raise procedural questions about the investigation itself. I know. Your own standing will be challenged, your marriage, your property rights. Your qualifications to be taken seriously as a complainant. She looked at him steadily. They can challenge whatever they want. The deed is filed and legal. The documents are public records. The physical evidence is preserved. And the pattern, she touched the stack. The pattern speaks for itself if you follow it carefully enough. He nodded. Then I have work to do. He stood, and she stood, and he shook her hand and then Rhett's hand with equal directness. I'll be in the county for at least 3 weeks. I'll send word through the commissioner's office if I need additional information from you. And Holt, she said, I'll make contact by the end of this week. After he left, the kitchen felt different. Not quieter. The same sounds, the same cold outside the window, the same ranch around them. But something had shifted in the air, the way the air shifts when something that has been building finally moves from potential to actual. Rhett poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without comment. They sat for a moment without saying anything. It's real now, he said. It's been real, she said. Now it's official. He turned his cup in his hands. How long do you think? Months. Carver was honest about that. There will be hearings and filings and all the machinery of a formal process, and that machinery moves at its own pace. She looked at her coffee. But it's moving. And Vivian? She's going to fight it. She has the resources and the connections, and she's been operating this way long enough that she believes she's untouchable. Maris paused. The question is whether she's going to fight it smart or fight it scared. Smart I can anticipate. Scared is harder, because scared people do unpredictable things. He looked at her. You're worried she'll do something else. I'm paying attention to the possibility. She picked up her coffee. That's all we can do. Holt sent word through Pepper 10 days after Carver's visit. The message was 3 lines, written in a hand that suggested a man more comfortable with a rope than a pen. I'll talk. Not on Mercer property, not in Cutter's Bend, county seat. Your investigator, somewhere private. You set it up and I'll be there. PUH Maris sent it to Carver's office that same afternoon. The meeting happened a week later. She wasn't there. It wasn't her place to be, and she understood that Holt's willingness to speak depended in part on the conversation being official rather than personal. But Carver sent a brief written summary through the commissioner's office 2 days after. Holt had given a full statement. He had named the 2 men who had been on the East Road the night of the Ashbourne barn fire. He had confirmed his knowledge of the Dunbar property fire 3 years prior, and named the individual who had given the order, an operations manager for the Mercer Holdings named Ellis Croft. He had described a pattern of instructions received over 6 years of employment that he had complied with, partially complied with, or in several cases quietly refused, the quietly refused part being why he was still employed and hadn't been trusted with the most direct actions. He had also stated, unprompted, that he wanted it noted in his testimony that he was coming forward because he believed what had been done to the Dunbar family and to the Ashbourne property was wrong, and that he had a child coming in April and didn't want to explain to that child someday that he had known and stayed quiet. Maris read this last part and sat quietly for a moment with the paper in her hands. She thought about her father saying that most people, given the right circumstances, will do the decent thing, that you couldn't count on it and you couldn't demand it, but if you built the circumstances carefully enough, you could make it more likely. She'd built the circumstances. Holt had done the decent thing. That was how it actually worked. Not neatly, not inevitably, but in that particular combination of preparation meeting, someone else's courage at the right moment. Ellis Croft was arrested in the 3rd week of March. The charge was arson, connected first to the Ashbourne fire, and then, as the investigation expanded, to the Dunbar fire 3 years prior. The warrant was executed by a territorial marshal rather than Sheriff Bale, which was a deliberate procedural choice that Carver had apparently argued for internally and won. Bale was informed of the arrest after it happened, which was the kind of thing that communicated a great deal without saying anything directly. The news moved through Cutter's Bend the way significant news moved through small communities, faster than anyone could track and slower than everyone wanted. Maris heard about it from Clara Granger, who arrived at the ranch the morning after the arrest with a jar of preserves and the particular expression of a woman who has been proven right about something she never wanted to be right about. People are talking, Clara said, sitting at the kitchen table. Len says half the men at the feed store this morning were talking about it, not quietly. What are they saying? That it wasn't an accident, that the Dunbar fire wasn't an accident, that maybe other things weren't accidents either. Clara put her hands around her coffee cup. There's a man, Beaumont, has a property north of here. He's been trying to get his east boundary surveyed formally for 2 years and being told there are complications with the records. He came to Len last night and asked if your investigator was someone he could speak to. Yes, Maris said. He can contact Carver's office directly. The commissioner's office has a public inquiry point now. That was part of what Carver set up when he arrived. Clara looked at her with the expression she'd had the morning after the fire, when she'd pulled the blanket tighter and said, "You organized this. You knew it was going to move like this, outward." I hoped it would. It was always bigger than our barn. Maris turned her cup. The property documentation Edna Pratt has doesn't just cover us. It covers everyone in this valley who's had a boundary dispute or a suspicious assessment in the past 15 years. Once people understand that someone is actually looking at these things with authority, they'll come forward. People have been absorbing things they couldn't explain for a long time. Clara was quiet. Then, the Dunbar family. They moved to the Eastern Territory. Do you think they'll come back? I don't know. Their land, the formal question of what happens to property that was lost through documented fraud, is something the territorial authorities will have to determine. But at minimum, they should know the truth of what was done to them. She paused. I wrote to them last week. I found the forwarding address through the county records. Clara stared at her. You wrote to them yourself. Someone had to. Vivian Mercer made one more move. It came in the form of a legal filing in the second week of April, a challenge to the validity of Maris's co-ownership of the Ashbourne property, arguing that the deed transfer had been improperly executed and that Maris lacked legal standing as a complainant in the investigation. It was filed by the outside lawyer Vivian had brought in from outside the territory, and it was precisely constructed and procedurally aggressive. Maris read the filing at the kitchen table and then read it again. Then she put it down and said, "She's scared." Rhett, standing at the counter, looked at her. That filing doesn't look scared to me. It looks like a serious legal challenge. It is a serious legal challenge, and she's scared. Maris touched the edge of the document. She spent 20 years being the most powerful person in any conflict in this valley. She's operated in a system she controlled, the assessor, the land board, the social pressure on everyone around her, and none of that is working. She looked up. When powerful people run out of structural advantages, they start making direct attacks on the people threatening them. That's what this is. It's not a strategy, it's a reaction. Can she win it? No. She said it without drama. The deed was properly executed and filed. I have the original filing confirmation from the county clerk's office, dated and stamped. She can challenge it. Her lawyer can raise procedural questions and slow things down. But the deed is legitimate, and any territorial court that actually looks at it will confirm that. She paused. What she's trying to do is generate enough procedural noise to undermine my standing as a complainant before the investigation reaches the point where it becomes irreversible. And has it reached that point? I think it has. I think Ellis Croft reaching that point. She was right about Croft. 3 weeks after his arrest, Ellis Croft made the decision that people in his position almost always make when they finally understand the size of what they're facing. He had a lawyer, a public one, who was honest with him about what the evidence showed and what the likely outcome was at trial. He had Holt's testimony. He had the physical evidence from the barn. He had the documented pattern of operations that Carver's investigation had by now assembled into something considerably larger than a single arson case. He took an arrangement. In exchange for a reduced charge on the Ashbourne fire and a formal cooperation agreement, Ellis Croft provided investigators with 3 years of detailed operational records he had kept, apparently out of the same instinct for self-protection that ultimately undid him, and direct testimony connecting Vivian Mercer to specific instructions related to both fires, the fraudulent survey work, and the systematic pressure campaign against multiple properties in the valley. He also produced correspondence. 8 letters, in Vivian Mercer's own handwriting, discussing the Ashbourne property specifically. One of them contained the phrase, "If the situation does not resolve before winter ends, more direct measures will be necessary." It had been written 6 days before the barn fire. When Carver sent Maris a summary of this development, she sat with it for a long time. 8 letters. In Vivian's own hand. The woman who had walked into Maris's kitchen with her imported coat and her practiced warmth and her careful hints about debt structures who had filed challenges and sent warnings wrapped in pleasantries, who had operated for 2 decades behind the comfortable assumption that her position made her permanently beyond consequence. 8 letters. The formal hearings ran through the spring and into early summer. Maris testified twice, once before the Territorial Land Board and once before a special hearing convened to address the fraudulent survey filings. She presented her evidence both times the way she'd presented it to Foss 6 months before, without performance, without emotion as a primary tool, following the documents in the order that told the story most clearly. The second time she testified, an older rancher named Beaumont was in the gallery. He'd come with Len Granger and 2 other men from the valley. She saw them when she came in, and she didn't acknowledge them during the testimony, because the testimony required all of her attention, but she knew they were there. Afterward, Beaumont stopped her in the hallway outside the hearing room. He was a big man, weathered, the kind of rancher who'd spent so many decades outdoors that the distinction between him and the landscape had become unclear. "Mrs. Ashbourne," he said. He held his hat. It seemed to be a gesture that men in this territory made when they were trying to say something they didn't have easy words for. "I had a boundary dispute in '89. I always thought I'd done something wrong, made an error in my original filing. Turns out the survey that voided my East 20 acres was filed by Gerald Hune." She looked at him. "I lost 20 acres of my best grazing land," he said. "I thought it was my own mistake for 12 years. "It wasn't your mistake," she said. He nodded slowly. "I know that now." He put his hat back on. "I just wanted to say what you did here, what you put together. A lot of people in this valley owe you something they're not going to have the right words for." She thought about her father, about Henry Calloway, sitting on a porch in the last autumn of his life, trying to solve an unsolvable problem with the only tools he had left, writing a letter with shaking hands to a man he'd pulled out of a river 11 years before. He hadn't planned this. He'd made the best decision available with the information he had, the way she'd always been taught. He couldn't have known what she would build with the circumstances he'd created. He'd just trusted that she would build something. "Thank you," she said to Beaumont. She meant it simply. J. Colton Briggs resigned from his position in June before the formal findings of the investigation were released. The resignation was accepted without ceremony. His successor was appointed from the territorial level, which was a structural change that Carver had apparently recommended in his formal report. Vivian Mercer did not resign. She fought every element of the process with the full resources available to her, which were considerable. Her outside lawyer was capable and thorough and raised procedural challenges that slowed certain elements of the proceedings for months. But capable and thorough runs out of options when the evidence is as carefully constructed as what Maris had built, and the correspondence Croft had produced was not something that legal argument could make disappear. The formal findings came in late July. 4 fraudulent survey filings voided. The Ashford parcel claim restored to the territory for proper reprocessing. The Dunbar family formally notified that their original homestead filing was being reopened on the grounds that the survey voiding it had been fraudulent. Property tax assessments for 11 parcels in Cutter's Bend County ordered, reviewed, and corrected from the date the irregularities began. Vivian Mercer was formally cited for conspiracy to commit fraud in land documentation and for directing the arson of the Dunbar and Ashbourne properties through an agent. The territorial prosecutor determined there was sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. The letter that contained the phrase "more direct measures will be necessary" was entered into the public record. Maris learned about the findings through Carver's office, the same way she'd learned about each development, a formal summary, precise and clear, the language of institutions doing what they were actually built to do when someone made them. She read it at the kitchen table in the evening, with Rhett across from her and the summer light coming in low through the window. When she finished, she set it down. "It's over," Rhett said. "The investigation is over. The legal proceedings will continue. The criminal case against Vivian will take more time, but the land questions are resolved. The fraudulent surveys are voided." She paused. "The Dunbar's filing is being reopened." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you hear back from them? After your letter?" "Yes." She'd gotten the Dunbar reply in May, a letter from Margaret Dunbar, written in the voice of a woman who had spent 3 years trying to rebuild something after an inexplicable disaster, and was only now beginning to understand that what happened to her family had not been inexplicable at all. They're considering coming back. Their children are settled in the east now, so it's not straightforward. But Margaret said she wanted to at least see the land again. Rhett turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was quiet in a way that was full rather than empty. I keep thinking about what this valley would look like, he said slowly, if none of this had ever happened. If the Ashfords had kept their parcel. If the Dunbars hadn't lost theirs. If Beaumont had his 20 acres, he paused. If she just let people have what was theirs. She'd have been slightly less wealthy, Maris said, and slightly less powerful. That was always the actual cost to her. She looked at the window. Some people can't tolerate any ceiling on what they can accumulate, even when the ceiling is just other people's legitimate rights. Does she understand what she's lost? Maris thought about it honestly. I think she understands the practical losses, the land claims, the influence, the safety of operating in a system she controlled. She paused. Whether she understands that she did something genuinely wrong, I don't know. People who operate that way for that long usually find ways to explain themselves to themselves. That's a troubling thought. It's a human one. She looked at him. The troubling version is thinking that she's unusual. She's not. The unusual thing was that she got caught. He held her gaze. Because of you. Because of documentation and patience and Holt having a baby coming in April. She almost smiled. And Edna Pratt, who waited 17 years for someone to come through her door with the right questions. And the Granger boys, who built us a barn in a week because Len told them what had happened. And you, who let a stranger into your house in the middle of winter and didn't pretend it was simple when it wasn't. He was quiet. A lot of people made this happen, she said. I organized it. That's what I'm good at. The evening light moved across the kitchen floor. Outside, the barn that the Granger boys had built stood solid and pale in the summer dusk, the new lumber having weathered to something less raw in the months since it went up. The horses were in from the pasture. The spring that ran down from the ridge above the property ran in its permanent and indifferent way, the way it had always run. Rhett got up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the property for a moment. She watched him, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood, the particular quality of stillness he had that she'd learned over months wasn't absence, but its opposite, a man fully present in a place. I want to tell you something, he said, still looking out the window. All right, he turned. I was ending when you showed up, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would have noticed. I was just slowly ending, getting smaller, managing less every year and calling it choosing less because that's an easier story to carry. She didn't say anything. She understood that he was telling her something he'd been working toward for a while and that it needed to come out in the order it was coming. Your father's letter. He stopped. I read it as a debt, an obligation I owed. And it was. But somewhere in the past 8 months, he looked at her with the plain directness that was the most honest thing about him. It stopped being an obligation and became something I'd have chosen anyway, if choosing had been an option from the beginning. The kitchen was quiet. The summer evening sat outside the window, warm and unhurried. I know I'm not easy, he said. I know I'm not someone who says things early enough or often enough. I know I went 4 years barely talking to anyone before you came through that gate, and I haven't entirely Rhett. He stopped. I know who you are, she said. I've been watching you carefully for 8 months. I know how you are with the horses when you think no one is looking. I know that you fixed the south fence the day after I fixed the ledger, because that was how you said thank you. I know that you drove to the county seat stage stop before sunrise and waited until I couldn't see you anymore. She looked at him steadily. I'm not waiting for a different version of you. I'm talking to the one that's here. He stood across the kitchen from her, and the distance between them felt different from what it had been at the beginning. Not smaller exactly, but changed in quality, like a distance that had been measured and found to be crossable. So, he said, his voice was rougher than usual. What are we? She considered it. She wasn't someone who reached for words before they were ready. We're two people who made a practical arrangement and built something real out of it. And what that means going forward, I think we get to decide that ourselves, without the pressure of either of us being in the worst situation of our lives. She paused. For the first time. He crossed the kitchen. He didn't say anything. He took her hand, the way they'd shaken hands at the beginning, across that same table, except nothing about it was the same, and he held it, and she let him, and that was enough for what it was. The summer turned. The valley changed in ways that were visible and ways that weren't. The Beaumont boundary was resurveyed and his 20 acres restored. He expanded his herd the following spring. Two other families from the valley came forward with their own documentation to Carver's formal follow-up process. And both cases resulted in assessment corrections that meant real money back to real people who had been quietly carrying losses they had attributed to their own failures. The Dunbar family came back in September. Margaret Dunbar was a woman about 15 years older than Maris, with the specific quality of someone who has survived something that shouldn't have been survived and isn't entirely sure yet what to do with the fact of that survival. She came with her husband and her youngest daughter, who was 12 years old and had no memory of the original property, only the story of leaving it. Maris met them at the edge of the reopened Dunbar parcel, which was overgrown and weather-beaten and would need significant work before it was viable again. She brought the original survey documents, the legitimate ones, not Hune's fabrication, and she walked the boundaries with Margaret while their husbands walked ahead, and the 12-year-old ran along the creek line with the abandon of someone experiencing something for the first time. "It's smaller than I remembered," Margaret said at one point, looking out over the land. "It usually is, and more work than I prepared myself for." She looked at the overgrown fence lines, the collapsed section near the north boundary, the years of unmanaged growth. "I don't know if we can bring it back to what it was." "You probably can't bring it back to what it was," Maris said, "but you might be able to bring it to something better than it was, depending on what you decide to do with it." Margaret looked at her. "You sound like someone who's done that." Maris thought about the barn, the ledger, the property tax assessments laid out against county averages on a winter afternoon, which had been the beginning of all of it. Rhett at the window saying I was ending when you showed up. Her father's letter pressed against her ribs on a frozen road, a woman walking towards something she didn't know yet and couldn't have predicted and wouldn't trade. "I'm in the middle of doing it," she said honestly. "I'll tell you when I know how it turns out." Margaret almost laughed. It was the kind of almost laugh that belongs to people who have been too serious for too long and are only beginning to remember how not to be. "Fair enough," she said. They walked the rest of the boundary in a companionable quiet, and the September light was warm on the overgrown land, and the creek ran along the eastern edge, with the sound of something that had waited patiently for the right people to come back. That evening, Maris stood on the porch of the Ashbourne house and watched the light go out of the sky over the ridge where the mountain spring began its long run downhill. The air smelled like late summer turning toward autumn, dry grass and cooling earth, and the faint particular sharpness that meant the season was preparing to shift. Rhett came out and stood beside her. They didn't need to fill the quiet. They'd learned that about each other months ago, that silence between them wasn't absence, that it didn't need to be managed or explained. But she found herself thinking, standing there, about what her father had known when he wrote that letter with his unsteady hand. He'd known she could survive the frontier alone. He'd said as much. In the way he'd said the plan she'd been making was one that would have worked. What he was doing wasn't rescuing her from failure. He was trying to give her something larger than survival. He was trying to give her a place to put all of it, the capability, the patience, the precision, the stubbornness that had always been too large for the circumstances she was in. Somewhere those things could matter at the scale they deserved to matter at. He'd been right, and she'd been right to be honest about what she needed in return, and to hold the line on that even when the easier thing would have been to be grateful and silent. The things you build when you tell the truth about what you need are sturdier than the things you build by pretending you need less. That was the thing she knew now that she hadn't had language for when she arrived. You could be practical and still be honest. You could choose safety and still demand dignity. You could build something real out of necessity, and it wouldn't be less real because it started that way. Everything that lasted started as something someone needed and became something they chose. "The Dunbar property," Rhett said. "You think they'll make it work?" "I think Margaret is the kind of person who makes things work when she has something solid to stand on." She looked at the ridge. "She has that now." "Because of you." "You. Because the truth was documented. That's different." He looked at her sideways. "You really can't take a compliment." "I can take accurate ones." "Then take this one. You came to this ranch 8 months ago with a carpet bag and $17, and someone tried to burn us out, and instead of leaving, you built a case that took down the most powerful woman in the county and got people their land back." He paused. That's yours. You can claim that. She was quiet for a moment. My father would have said I just followed the money, she said finally. And what do you say? She looked out at the ranch, the barn, pale and solid in the evening light, the fence lines she'd walked and the pastures she'd reorganized and the account books that finally told an honest story about a property moving in the right direction. The gate at the end of the drive, which still made its complaint when someone lifted the latch, but which she no longer heard with the same apprehension she'd brought to it in those first weeks. I say my father was a very wise man, she said, and I'm grateful every day that I'm his daughter. Rhett's hand found hers in the dusk, unhurried and without ceremony, the way things happen between people who have already proven themselves to each other in the ways that matter. They stood there as the light finished leaving the sky, and the first cold of the coming season moved down from the ridge, and the ranch settled around them in the particular way of a living thing at rest. Not finished, not perfect, not free from whatever the next season would bring. Just standing, together, theirs. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.